Hello, hello. We are going to be going over J20 in this video, which is all about the principle of square roots. So it's just one little concept. I'm going to do a couple of examples and then let you try some, and then that is pretty much the section. So hopefully a nice, easy homework section for you. The principle of square roots basically says if we have a number that, or a variable that is squared and it's equal to a number, then that variable either equals the negative or positive square root of that number. So let me just give you an example. If I had something like x squared equals 16, right? Then we can probably do this in our head. We know what numbers we would have to square to get 16, right? 4 gives us 16, but also negative 4 squared gives us 16. So what this principle is saying is that when we take the square root of that variable in order to cancel out the square, we could either get a positive or negative solution. Okay, so that means that x would equal a positive 4 or a negative 4, giving us two solutions, right? Now, when you get two solutions of this kind in my math lab, it doesn't have a plus or minus button. So you would have to enter negative 4 and then also 4 for your two answers. Okay, so that's pretty much all we're going to go over, is trying to get a squared variable isolated so that we can solve it by taking the square root. Okay, so let's look at these examples. The first one says 3x squared minus 21 equals 0. We want to get this x squared isolated all by itself. So we're going to add 21 to both sides to get the squared term by itself. And then to get the x squared by itself, now that we have that term isolated, we need to get rid of that 3. And we do that by dividing. So we have x squared is equal to 7. And then, excuse me, we can take the square root of both sides. Don't forget that plus or minus. Okay? Don't forget. That affects the number of answers you get. Okay? So we end up with x is equal to negative square root of 7 or positive square root of 7. Square root of 7 is not a radical that can be simplified, and I'm pretty sure in this section it has you enter your answers as reduced radicals, not as decimals. So make sure you leave it in this form. Okay. If it allows you to enter a decimal, it will tell you like enter your answer rounded to the nearest tenth or something like that. So you'll know that that's an acceptable way to enter it. Okay. Let's look at the second one. Same idea. We're going to isolate the squared term. And actually, if you notice, this is something we could solve by doing a difference of squares, right? We could factor this into m plus 12, m minus 12. So whichever solving strategy works for you, I'm totally fine with you doing that in your homework. But just for the purpose of this section, I'm going to go ahead and solve it using the square root method. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and move our 144 to the other side by adding. So I have m squared is equal to 144. And then we take the square root. Don't forget your plus or minus, which leaves us with m equals plus or minus 12. Okay? Or in other words, m can be negative 12 or positive 12. Okay? All right, so there are two for y'all to try. Go ahead and pause the video and give those a go, and then unpause it when you're ready to go over them. Okay, let's see how you did. On the first one, we need to isolate the z squared, so we move our 1 to the other side by adding, and then we can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus, which results in z equaling a positive 5 or a negative 5. Okay. That's the first one. Second one, same thing. We need to get the term with the x squared isolated. So we're going to move our 75 to the other side. Once we have our squared term isolated, then we need to isolate the squared variable. So we get rid of the 5 by dividing. So x squared equals 15. And then we take the square root of both sides. Again, don't forget your plus or minus. Okay, square root of 15 doesn't simplify, right? Because 15, even if we were to try to factor it, it's just 3 times 5. So it's not a perfect square, and it doesn't have a perfect square within it. So we can't do anything to simplify that. So we're going to leave that as it is, and then be sure to write it out as negative square root of 15 or positive square root of 15. Okay. One other thing I will mention on this section, just to be sure we are aware of it, is that we only want to use this method of solving if all we have is a squared variable. Notice all we have is a squared variable with constant terms, right? Squared variable, constant terms. If you had something like 5x squared minus x equals 10, something like that, we could not use the square root method on this problem, right? Because we have this variable, okay? You can only, so no on that one. We can only use the square root method if all we have is like an x squared or a z squared or an m squared, okay? You can't have a regular term. If we were given something like this, we would have to move the 10 to the other side and then try to factor it using our sum product AC method, okay? All right, so that is the end of J20, short and sweet and to the point. If you have any questions on this section, please let me know.